The story of George Washington begins long before he understood what a nation was, before he knew that his life would one day be spoken of in classrooms, whispered in battlefields, carved into stone, and argued over by scholars. It begins in the quiet rolling fields of colonial Virginia, where the soil was red, the tobacco sprouted in long green rows, and the Potomac River cut its slow, unhurried path toward the wide Chesapeake. The world into which he was born in 1732 was not yet America. It was a set of British colonies bound by loyalty, trade, and unspoken hierarchies. It was a land full of contradictions, wealth and slavery, ambition and obedience, opportunity and restriction. It shaped him long before he shaped it. He was a boy of the frontier, raised among tall forests and stubborn earth. His father, Augustine Washington, was a planter of modest success, often away managing lands, leaving young George to wander the plantations and watch enslaved field hands work in the sun. He was not old enough to understand what he was seeing, not old enough to grasp the brutality woven into the ordinary rhythms of colonial life. What he did understand was the land, the way the wind smelled before rain, the way deer slipped silently through the trees, the way the river pulled at its banks and tugged at small boats like a restless creature. Death came early to the Washington household. Augustine died when George was only 11, and childhood ended abruptly. The future that had been intended for him, study in England, the education reserved for wealthy planters' sons, dissolved overnight. He would not inherit Mount Vernon. That belonged to his half-brother Lawrence. What remained to him were a handful of smaller properties, the guidance of his mother, and the determination to carve his own life from the wilderness. He grew tall earlier than most boys his age, broad-shouldered, long-limbed, his posture already bearing the stiffness of self-control he would one day become known for. He studied mathematics, surveying, and the practical sciences. He learned to ride with grace, becoming one of the finest horsemen in Virginia. But inwardly he stood apart, watching everything with quiet intensity. People later described him as reserved, almost cold, but those who knew him best saw the heat beneath the surface, the hunger for accomplishment, the desire to rise above the circumstances of his birth. Surveying offered him his first real glimpse of the frontier beyond Virginia's plantations. At 16, he joined a surveying expedition into the rugged lands of the Shenandoah Valley. For weeks, he slept beneath the open sky, measured distances through dense forest, crossed swollen streams, and watched the sun rise in untouched wilderness. The frontier carved itself into him, its silence, its danger, its promise, all of it settled deep in his bones. It was there he first understood that the world was much larger than any map or lineage. By the time he was 20, the colonies sat on the edge of something they could not quite name. Territories claimed by both France and Britain overlapped in distant forests. Native nations held lands Europeans feared to enter. Tension simmered like a taut wire, ready to snap. Washington, ambitious and eager for distinction, entered military service in the Virginia militia. He felt the thrill of a future opening before him, a chance to earn rank, honor, recognition. He could not know that his first mission would ignite a worldwide war. In the spring of 1554, he was sent west with a small force to warn the French to withdraw from the Ohio Valley. The journey was grueling. Rain, mud, swollen rivers. He was only 22, yet he carried himself with the seriousness of a man twice his age. Along the way he met with native leaders, navigating fragile alliances, trying to assert British claims in a world not yet decided. Then came the clash at Jumonville Glen, a brief chaotic burst of gunfire in the dripping forest. Shots rang out from the underbrush. Smoke hung low. Men fell quickly. The French commander, Ensign Jumonville, was killed under circumstances that became the subject of fierce dispute. Washington had not intended to start a war, but by signing a French-written surrender document he could barely read, he unwittingly took responsibility for what the French called an assassination. His name traveled across oceans, across royal courts, across the halls of European power. The French and Indian War erupted soon after, and Washington's young reputation grew amid hardship and bloodshed. He fought under the command of General Edward Braddock, a rigid British officer who believed European tactics would triumph in American forests. Washington tried to warn him that the wilderness fought by different rules. Braddock ignored him. The ambush along the Monongahela River in 1555 was a slaughter. Smoke filled the trees. War cries echoed from unseen enemies. Redcoats fell in heaps. Horses screamed as bullets tore through them. In this chaos, Washington rode back and forth across the line, rallying the terrified survivors. 2 horses were shot from beneath him. Bullets tore through his coat. When it was over, he stood untouched, as though death itself had stepped aside. Survivors whispered that he had been chosen by Providence. He did not feel chosen. He felt the weight of every fallen man. War hardened him, carved away the last traces of youth. He learned endurance, command, the bitter taste of defeat, the sharpness of responsibility. He resigned his commission in frustration when British officers refused to the rank he believed he'd earned. Yet he remained restless, hungry for purpose. Drawn toward Mount Vernon after the death of his brother Lawrence, the estate became his home, sprawling fields, orchards, enslaved workers, and the Potomac River rolling steadily beyond the trees. He married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with grace and warmth. She brought 2 young children and significant property into the marriage. Their home was lively, full of visits, dinners, estate business, and quiet companionship. Washington became a planter, a businessman, a member of the House of Burgesses. Yet beneath the surface something unsettled remained. The life of a gentleman farmer fit him, but did not satisfy him. The British Empire tightened its grip on the colonies. Taxes, restrictions, soldiers in the streets. Each new measure felt like a hand closing around the throat of the American spirit. Washington watched with growing anger as Parliament treated the colonies not as partners, but subjects. He read political essays, corresponded with other Virginian leaders, and felt the tension rising inside him like a storm building in the distance. By 1775, revolution had already sparked in Massachusetts. Blood had been spilled at Lexington and Concord. The Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, and Washington arrived wearing his old military uniform, a silent declaration of intent. He did not seek command, but when it was offered, he accepted with solemn gravity. The cause now belonged to him as much as he belonged to it. He took command of an army that barely deserved the name, ragged, hungry, undisciplined, short on powder, short on everything except hope. He stood before them, tall and grave, promising not victory, but sacrifice. He rode among the camps, learning the men's hardships, listening to their complaints, trying to forge unity from desperation. The siege of Boston tested him. Supply lines collapsed. Disease stalked from every direction. Yet Washington held firm, slowly turning the unruly bands of militiamen into something resembling a fighting force. When cannon seized from Fort Ticonderoga were dragged across frozen mountains by Henrik Knox and placed on the hills around Boston, the British were forced to evacuate. It was Washington's first major success, a quiet roar across the colonies that the rebels might withstand the greatest empire on earth. But the war was only beginning. New York became a crucible. Washington defended it as best he could, though he knew the odds were impossible. The British arrived in overwhelming numbers, ships filling the harbor like a floating city of canvas and masts. The battles that followed were brutal and disheartening. The Continental Army was driven from Long Island, from Manhattan, across New Jersey, retreating mile by mile as winter pressed in. Desertions increased, supplies dwindled. The rebellion hovered on the edge of annihilation. Washington refused to surrender to despair. Though exhausted, though nearly defeated, he held to one last audacious plan. On a freezing Christmas night, he led his men across the ice-choked Delaware River. The wind cut like knives. Oars froze in hands. Ice groaned against the boats. Yet they crossed, silently, grimly. The attack on Trenton was swift and decisive. It was victory when victory was needed most, a spark in the darkness. Days later came Princeton, another triumph wrested from impossibility. The war dragged on, years marked by hardship, shortages, and bitter winters. Valley Forge tested the Army's strength and Washington's resolve. Men shivered in tattered clothes, starved in the cold, slept on frozen ground. Disease stalked the camp, claiming hundreds. Washington rode through the snow each morning, visiting the makeshift hospitals, speaking with officers, pleading with Congress for supplies. He carried the suffering of his men in his silent gaze. When Baron von Steuben arrived and began drilling the army with a discipline they had never known, Washington saw hope take shape before his eyes. The alliance with France shifted the balance of the war. Slowly, painfully, the tide turned. The British moved south, unleashing cruelty and chaos. Washington watched from afar, sending Greene to wage a brutal campaign of endurance. When Cornwallis entrenched himself at Yorktown, Washington understood this was the moment history had been marching toward. He set the Great Deception in motion, tricking the British into believing New York was his target. Then he led his army, French and American, on a sweeping march south. The siege began with earthworks carved under fire, trenches dug by lantern glow, cannons roaring day and night. Washington watched the bombardment from the Grand Battery, his face lit by the flashes that tore open the sky. When American troops stormed the British redoubts in the dead of night, climbing the walls under musket fire, Washington stood on a distant ridge, breathless with pride and fear. Cornwallis surrendered soon after, and though the war did not end immediately, its conclusion was sealed. Washington returned to Mount Vernon briefly, longing for peace, yet he was called again to public life. The nation struggled under the Articles of Confederation, weak, fractured, drifting. A new constitution was drafted, and all eyes turned to Washington to lead the young republic. He accepted the presidency not with ambition, but with duty. His inauguration in 1789 carried a solemnity unlike any coronation or ceremony before it. He walked onto the stage of history not as a conqueror, but as a steward, a man aware that every decision would set precedents for generations yet unborn. His presidency was marked by restraint, by the careful balancing of competing forces, by the belief that the republic must never become a monarchy in disguise. He faced rebellions, foreign pressures, political factions tearing at the seams of unity. He held firm, guiding the fragile experiment through its infancy. When his second term ended, he did what kings never did, what conquerors never dreamed of doing. He stepped down. He walked away from power, returning to Mount Vernon in the quiet manner of a man who had simply finished his work.
Washington rode away from the surrender field at Yorktown with the weight of an entire continent pressing against his shoulders. Victory had come, but peace was still far away, and the fragile union he had fought for was trembling like a newborn creature struggling to stand. As he traveled north with his officers, the countryside seemed to breathe differently. Farmers lifting their heads from the fields to watch him pass, children waving from dusty roadsides, freedmen calling out blessings as he rode. They saw a hero. He felt only exhaustion. Winter winds crept down from the mountains as he reached the Hudson Valley, cutting through coats and tents like knives. Snow gathered on pine branches, and the river froze in long silver sheets. The army settled at Newburgh, the last encampment of the war, but no one knew how long they would stay. Congress was broke. Soldiers were unpaid, hungry, and angry. Many had not seen their families in years. They had buried friends in unmarked graves from Boston to the Carolinas. They wanted their freedom, yes, but they wanted fairness too. Whispers spread through the camp. Quiet at first, then louder. Letters circulated calling for officers to confront Congress by force. Some spoke of marching on Philadelphia. Others insisted Washington should become king. Officers closed tents before discussing plans, as if silence could hide the dangerous spark catching fire inside their hearts. They loved Washington, trusted him, and believed the nation owed them justice. And yet the idea of using the army to fix the nation's political failures grew stronger every night. When Washington heard the rumors, he walked alone into the frozen evening, the distant campfires flickering like constellations scattered across the valley. The thought of soldiers turning their rage against the very dream they had fought to build weighed heavily on him. His boots sank into the snow with each step, and the cold stung his face, but his mind burned. If the army fractured into rebellion now, the revolution would devour itself. Everything they had won would turn to ash. A meeting of officers was called for the next day. Washington was not expected to attend. Many assumed he would stay above the conflict, allowing the officers to vent their fury. Instead, he appeared suddenly at the doorway, wearing his travel coat, icy winds swirling behind him. Conversations died instantly. Chairs scraped. Men stood. Washington walked slowly toward the front, his gait slightly stiff from years of riding and wounds that had never fully healed. He spoke without shouting, but every word cut through the room like a blade. He acknowledged their suffering, their unpaid wages, their sacrifices that Congress had allowed to go unrecognized. Then he paused. His voice softened, trembling just slightly, as he warned them that turning their anger into violence would destroy the Republic before it truly lived. His officers shifted uneasily, some breathing hard, some staring at the floor. They admired him, yes, but admiration could not erase hunger or rage. Washington unfolded a letter sent from a member of Congress. He held it up, then hesitated. He reached for his spectacles, rarely seen, worn only during moments of unbearable fatigue. As he slid them onto his face, he murmured quietly, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown not only gray but nearly blind in the service of my country." The room broke. Some officers wept openly. Others covered their faces with their hands. The idea of turning against the man who had given everything, his youth, his strength, his sight, to serve the cause, was unbearable. The plot dissolved in minutes. The rebellion died before it was born, smothered by Washington's humility rather than force. He had saved the revolution once on the battlefield, and now he saved it again with nothing more than honesty. As the spring thaw loosened winter's grip, Washington prepared to do something no victorious general had done in centuries. He planned to surrender power. He traveled to Annapolis to meet Congress, riding through small towns where people gathered at crossroads to watch him pass. Some saluted, some bowed, some simply stared, stunned. Washington could have seized the nation for himself. Instead, he wanted to hand it back to the people. The chamber was silent when he entered, the members of Congress rising in unison. He removed his commission from his coat, his hands steady, but his voice thick. He thanked them for their trust, praised the bravery of the soldiers, and asked only that they care for the men who had carried the revolution on their backs. When he finished, he bowed once, deeply, humbly, and walked out as a private citizen again. The room erupted in tears. London newspapers printed the news with disbelief. Kings and princes across Europe were stunned. A victorious commander laying down power willingly seemed a myth, a fable, something whispered but never witnessed. Yet Washington meant it. He returned to Mount Vernon with the quiet longing of a man who wanted nothing more than to plant crops and walk through his fields again. But the peace he imagined did not last. The nation he had helped birth trembled like an infant learning to breathe. Congress collapsed into bickering. States quarreled. Farmers revolted. The Union threatened to fracture. Washington watched from his porch as riders carried newspapers down the dusty road, reporting crisis after crisis. He tried to ignore them, to immerse himself in the rhythm of the plantation, rising with dawn, inspecting crops, speaking gently to tenants, walking the river's edge in the evening shadows. But his country pulled at him. Every headline felt like a message addressed to him personally. When he was summoned to lead the Constitutional Convention, he accepted reluctantly. Philadelphia in summer smelled of sweat, horses, and politics. Delegates argued for months behind closed windows, the heat thick enough to make temper spark. Washington presided silently, his presence alone a stabilizing force. At night he walked the brick streets in the warm, humid air, the gas lamps glowing above him as he pondered the fragile nation they were piecing together. When the Constitution was finally complete, the people wanted a president, one who could calm fears, unite states, and ensure that the new government would not devour itself. They wanted Washington. He accepted only because he feared what might happen if he refused. His first inauguration in New York felt like stepping into a dream. Crowds pressed against buildings, cheering as he walked the wooden planks of Federal Hall. He was not eager. His hands tightened on the balcony railing. Power made him uneasy. Responsibility weighed heavier than any sword. Yet he served. He traveled to each state, listening to farmers, merchants, freedmen, veterans. He tried to govern without favor, without ego, without ambition. His cabinet quarreled, Hamilton with his sharp brilliance, and Jefferson with his quiet fire. Newspapers attacked him. Political parties formed like storms on opposite horizons. The presidency aged him faster than any winter campaign. Still, he continued. He walked through muddy roads to inspect canals, stood in fields where new towns would rise, spoke to native leaders with solemn respect, resisted every attempt to lure him into monarchy. When rebels rose in Pennsylvania, he rode at the head of the army not to crush them, but to calm them. He wanted America to stand on its own legs, to learn self-government, to be something the world had never seen. Years passed, his hair whitened, his voice softened, his steps slowed. When he announced he would not run for a third term, the nation gasped. No one had ever seen power so willingly returned. The farewell burned with quiet wisdom, warnings against division, against hate, against foreign entanglements. He hoped they would listen. He feared they would forget. He returned to Mount Vernon walking the fields with the steady pace of a man who had given every ounce of his strength to something larger than himself. Storm clouds gathered over the Potomac. Winter chilled the air. Washington worked in the freezing rain one afternoon, inspecting fences and wheat, stubborn as always. By nightfall, he felt a strange tightness in his throat. He dismissed it, sipped tea, and went to bed. By morning, he could hardly breathe. Doctors bled him, believing they were saving him. Servants watched helplessly. His wife Martha held his hand, her eyes wet but steady. Washington struggled for breath, then finally whispered, "I am not afraid." His voice was quiet, rasped by pain, but fearless. His final request was simple. "Let me go. It is well." The house fell silent. Outside, snow drifted softly across the fields he loved. Inside, the man who had shaped a nation slipped away with the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. But the nation did not fall silent. It grew, slowly, painfully, triumphantly, carrying his legacy forward like a torch into the centuries that followed. His life became a story told in schools, whispered at campfires, carved into marble. Not the story of a perfect man, but of a man who resisted the temptation of power, who walked through war without losing his humanity, who believed that a free people must choose their own destiny. And long after the snow melted from the fields of Mount Vernon, long after the Revolution's soldiers were gone, long after the capital moved and cities rose, Americans still looked back to him, not as a king, not as a legend carved in stone, but as the man who showed a nation how to stand.